Hello, everybody. I want to thank everybody for coming out today. It's incredible to be able to host Evan Wolfson, the president and founder of Freedom to Marry. We're also honored to have Provost Lauren Rebel here to do an introduction for Evan. Before I hand it over to her, I want to thank you all for attending, but I also want to thank the co-sponsors that helped make this event possible. Along with ACS, we have the Family Law Society, the LGBT Legal Project, the Outlaw, the Mauer LGBT Alumni Advisory Committee, and then Law Students for Reproductive Justice. So can everybody join me in welcoming Lauren Rebel, please?
Well, thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you to all of the Mauer groups that cooperated with ACS and the faculty in bringing Evan Wolfson back to campus. Evan's, obviously, Indiana is ground zero right now in the fight for civil rights and marriage equality. And we need very much to focus on this as an issue about which we have hope and think about the trajectory that we've seen in the time since Evan first came to our law school, many decades ago now it is. But we also need to recognize that this is an issue that we can't turn our eyes away from. I'm particularly delighted to be here today to have an opportunity to introduce Evan Wolfson because Evan is an example of the kind of creativity and legal imagination that changes the world. Often I think, and I'm speaking to the law students in the room, often I think when you're in class and working your way towards an understanding of a field, it's easy to lose sight of the possibilities that the law opens up for transformation in fundamental ways of the social bargain that our society has with its citizens. And Evan is somebody who took an idea, a set of ideas, and not only broke them open and made them real for our country, but did so in a way that used law with intense amounts of creativity and imagination. So his presence in our law school is triply exciting for exactly that reason. I want to start by just noting that Indiana University has been very, very clear about its position on the marriage amendment that the General Assembly has been considering for the past several months. When President McRobbie took a position on this on behalf of our university, he said, "Equality, compassion, and respect for individuals have long been the bedrock of Indiana University's educational mission. The lack of tolerance implicit in this bill runs counter to IU's deeply held values. We are proud to join Freedom Indiana Coalition, and in doing so, stand with some of Indiana's most respected employers and organizations on the side of fairness." I think it is fair to say that our university would not have been able to imagine taking this position without the work that Evan Wolfson has done for the last several decades. The strength of Freedom Indiana, the organization to which IU belongs, owes a great deal to the support of the organization Freedom to Marry, of which Evan Wolfson is the founder and president. Beginning with his 1983 Harvard Law School thesis on the right to marry, he has been at the forefront of the fight against discrimination against our gay citizens. And not in the marriage arena alone, but in every aspect of civil rights that is important for for our country and for our citizens. He has championed civil rights in numerous cases involving military personnel's freedom to serve, the rights of gay parents, and rights to employment, medical treatment, and partner benefits. And his influence has extended far beyond the United States. He has worked with marriage equality efforts in particular in several countries, including Argentina, Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand. He is the author of Why Marriage Matters, America, Equality, and Gay People's Right to Marry. And if you follow his Twitter feed, you know that he has been watching what has been happening in our state very, very closely. We are extraordinarily fortunate to have him here today to talk with us about it. Please join me in welcoming Evan Wolfson.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yes. I'm going to come out behind because this is as tall as I get. So, thank you very much for that very generous introduction and very touching to me. I have been to Indiana many, many times, and it is, as you alas truthfully said, over many decades. And I couldn't be happier, though, than to have so brilliantly timed the trip as to be here again this week, because as you rightly said, Indiana is ground zero. Indiana is a crucial battleground in this civil rights and human rights struggle. And though, as I will discuss in a moment, it is a very dynamic landscape with enormous changes, multiple flashpoints, and irrefutable momentum, the work that you are doing, the cause that Indiana University so admirably is part of, is central to this struggle that is unfolding in our country right now. So this is not just a chance for us to talk and have Q&A. This is living history, and this is the place. Because hopefully what's unfolding now here in Indiana is really the last-ditch effort of the anti-gay forces to stampede into effect barriers against the direction in which our country and the world is headed. You have the opportunity right now to thwart this desperate last effort to turn Indiana away from where the country and the world is headed. And if we are able to defeat this anti-gay, cruel, shameful effort to write discrimination into the state constitution, it will probably mark the last time that tactic, that radical and despicable tactic, is used as the last effort to stop this civil rights campaign. So the work that's unfolding here, the work I hope many of you are volunteering and are part of, is what civil rights feels like. We can read about it in books, we can watch it on TV, we can hear the stories of people who are older than us, but this is what it is. It's people who stand up and work to make their community, our country, the world, a better place. And right now, the eyes of history are on Indiana. As was said, though it's increasingly hard to remember, I was once like many of you. I was a law student. And decades ago now, I remember the first time somebody introduced me and said, 30 years ago he wrote his paper. And I was like, now it's 31. So 31 years ago, I wrote my paper on gay people and the freedom to marry. And I made two basic arguments in that paper. The first was that you can't say you're for equality and yet acquiesce in exclusion from the central social and legal institution of this and virtually every other society. Marriage is important. Marriage brings tangible and intangible meanings, protections, and responsibilities. And to be denied marriage is to be denied something precious and very really important in day-to-day life and in times of crisis. And the second argument I made in the paper was that by claiming the freedom to marry, by making the case for why gay people should share in the freedom to marry, we would be seizing an engine of change, an engine of transformation, a language of love and commitment and family and inclusion and connection, a language of understanding that would transform non-gay people's understanding of who gay people are and thereby advance the inclusion and opportunity that gay people have been denied. When I wrote that paper as a student, like many of you, nowhere in the world could gay people marry. Today, we have won the freedom to marry, the ability to share in the freedom to marry, in 18 countries on 5 continents. There are more than 200 countries, so plenty left to do. And of course, since there was nowhere in the world where gay people could marry, nowhere in the United States, when I wrote this paper, could gay people share in the freedom to marry. Today, we have won the freedom to marry in 17 states and the District of Columbia, our nation's capital, which means that 40% of the American people now live in a state where gay people can marry, up from 0 a decade ago. 40%. That means, well, since we're law students, we don't always nimbly go to the math, but 40% having the freedom to marry means we still have a lot of work to do. But as everybody can feel it and everybody can see it, we have the momentum. We have the strategy. The country is moving forward. Where once the opposition was able to throw a president and a pope and religion and business voices and the sheer weight of the majority and prejudice and fear and ignorance against us, now we have a president who, as recently as last night, champions the freedom to marry. We have a pope who talks about the importance of treating people first and foremost with love and commitment and the golden rule. And we have the majority of the American people now favoring the freedom to marry. When I was doing the case in Hawaii in 1996, the case that launched this ongoing global movement, 27% of the American people supported the freedom to marry. Today, a mere 17 and change years later, we've more than doubled that number to 55%. Americans have been on a journey. Americans have opened their hearts and changed their mind. And that journey is exactly what the anti-gay forces who are squeezing your legislature now are trying to block here in Indiana. The people of Indiana deserve to have the same conversations, the same ability to hear the stories of gay Hoosiers and their non-gay family members and the businesses and the universities and the community that supports and welcomes them. Indianans deserve to have the opportunity to have those conversations, to hear those stories, and to reflect on the shared values that are the highest expression that most of us do indeed aspire to. Treating others as you want to be treated, being fair, being respectful, being compassionate, and according everyone the liberty, the freedom, the pursuit of happiness, the equality under the law that are what our country promises us. Sometimes it takes people time to reconnect with their own values and to apply it to what to them is a new circumstance, or to unlearn something they'd been taught and see with fresh eyes the realities, the human realities before them. It takes time and conversations, and as I've said for years, there's no marriage without engagement. It takes engagement. And that engagement those conversations, those stories, those reflections on deeper values, that rising to fairness, that journey, is what the lawmakers who are pushing this anti-gay attack don't trust the people of Indiana to have. They want to shut it down. They want to prevent the people of this state from showing that same movement, that same journey, as now a majority of Americans have taken. And so the campaign, Freedom Indiana, the work that many of you are doing, is about giving people in this state the opportunity to have those conversations, to hear the stories, to reach for their values, to push past prejudice or the unknowns or fear, to unlearn some of what they've been taught and embrace the reality of people's lives and their actual values. If lawmakers pushing the anti-gay agenda trusted the people of Indiana, they wouldn't need a constitutional amendment. They wouldn't need to freeze a retrograde discrimination into the document. It's precisely because they don't trust the people, and most especially, they don't trust younger people, that they're doing this last-ditch effort now. And we can't let them do that. We can't let Indiana point backward at the very same time as the world is spinning forward. Now, why have we seen this momentum? Why has the country taken this journey? Why has a majority now come into being when it was, after all about whether a small minority should be able to share? The most powerful engine of that change, the reason it has happened, was actually very well exemplified by President Obama when he first talked about his change of heart and his embrace of the freedom to marry back in 2012. The president went on TV, had an interview. You can watch it on YouTube if you haven't seen it. And he talked about how he had moved from his view that it was okay to just give gay people something else, civil union, partnership, but to deny us the freedom to marry. And he told a story and spoke not as a president, not as a lawyer, not as a constitutional law scholar, which he is. He spoke first and foremost as a parent. And he told how he and Michelle, the First Lady, had conversations at the dinner table with their daughters, Malia and Sasha. And the girls said to the President and the First Lady that they have classmates in their school who are being raised by gay parents. And the girls said, it's not fair that those families should be treated differently from our family. And the President said, I thought about that conversation. I thought about the gay people I know, my staff, supporters, people I've seen parent, people I've seen caring for their aging parents, people I've seen in loving and committed relationship with one another. And I thought about what the girls said, and I realized that if I am going to teach my daughters what I want to teach them as a Christian, as a parent, the golden rule of treating others as you want to be treated, respecting other people, respecting difference, if I'm going to teach those values, I have to live up to them. And I knew I had to change. When the president described that journey, his word was evolution, it rang very, very true. It resonated because it's exactly the same journey that so many millions of Americans and so many people right now in Indiana are taking. And it is our job to give people the stories, the conversation, the engagement, and the time to take that journey. Conversation is the powerful weapon that has brought about this change. It used to be said, not so long ago in our movement, that the number one engine of changing people's misinformation and fear, and in some cases prejudice and even hatred of gay people, was knowing someone who's gay. That was sort of the commonplace conventional wisdom that we all said, and we thought it was true, and that's what people describe even today. People will say that the most important thing is to come out. Well, in fact, it was so conventional wisdom, it was so much what we thought was true, that when President Clinton, back in 1993, signed the so-called defense don't ask, don't tell policy, the policy saying that gay people in the military could remain in the military as long as they don't tell anyone they're there. When he signed that policy, ironically, he quoted this wisdom that the #1 engine of changing people's hearts and minds is knowing someone who's gay, even as he signed a law that was intended to prevent people from knowing who's gay. But it turns out, over the 20 years since, we've actually learned, and as America's been on this journey, and as we've been in this campaign, and as we've had these conversations and moved public opinion, and moved decision makers, and moved Republicans as well as Democrats, and moved courts and legislatures and electorates, we've actually learned that that conventional wisdom was not exactly right. It's actually, it turns out, not knowing someone who's gay that gives people the chance to rise to fairness. It's having a conversation with someone who's gay or with a non-gay person the person trusts. Conversation is the key engine. And those are the conversations we need here in Indiana. And those conversations need to continue past the date when we're safely out of the woods and succeed in defeating this attack and attempt to shut the conversation down. Those conversations need to continue so that we don't just defeat an anti-gay attack, but actually end the anti-gay discrimination that prevails in the state. Defeating an amendment is a good thing. It's like waking up alive. You want to do it. But you also want more out of your day. And so, while we must remain vigilant and work hard, and this campaign continues, and despite the success we had in the House in amending the bill that now goes to the Senate for whatever skirmishing and battling and potential shenanigans may occur, and the work we have to do to make sure that that bill is defeated this round, and that at the very least an amended version comes so that the effort gets pushed down through 2 more cycles and doesn't go on the ballot this year, important and urgent and pressing and real as that work is still right now. When we succeed in blocking or defeating the amendment over the next several weeks with your help, that's not enough. That's when the real work starts. Because the real work is those conversations about who gay people are, about who non-gay people are in the state who care about gay people and justice and fairness and inclusion and the golden rule, to create the space for the freedom to marry to come here just as we bring it throughout the country. So we have a lot of work to do. But the story that you're hearing is that when we do this work that people at the time will see as impossible or sometimes not even worth fighting for, it turns out you can change things, and you can make a better country, and you can affect real lives. And that's the most exciting part of the law, certainly the most exciting part of being a lawyer, and it's what we have as Americans the precious opportunity to do. People don't always feel like they can change their society. They don't always feel they can change the law, and in many cases, they're right. But one of the great things in the midst of so much frustration and dysfunction and imperfection is that here we can change things. And that here is certainly America, and it's also Indiana. This is the moment, this is the place, this is the battleground, this is the battle. I hope all of you will really engage in this campaign, the Freedom Indiana campaign, to defeat the attack and then to do the work of getting Indiana and America where it needs to be. And then, there are how many other countries left? please join. Thank you. Thank you. So I actually really wanted to leave time, and sometimes people say that, but they don't, but I did. So I wanted to leave time for questions and comments and pushback and devil's advocacy, so please take it. Yes.
I want to preface this with saying that I don't doubt that a lot of the young people who are about to push for marriage are well intentioned. You know, they do a lot of good work. But how do you respond to the criticism that a lot of issues have fallen by the wayside? Issues like homelessness, trans issues, bullying, workplace discrimination. I mean, this is coming at a time when, you know, in all Obama's rhetoric in the State of the Union about, you know, workplace empowerment, and there was not one single mention about, you know, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and that was still like dead in the house. And, you know, it's coming at a time when, you know, like 46% of gay people report being harassed or discriminated in the workplace, and like 90% of trans people want to say. I mean, how do you feel about a president that voted 13 times against marriage, and until like about 3 months before he decided to run for election? And you know how some supporters, people in the gay community, including some of my friends in the legal community, have said that, you know, a lot of the, you know, agenda at the top is controlled by people, like a subset of the gay community who has an vested interest in marriage, but not really like other issues that don't really concern.
Right. So you bundled in a lot of things, and I actually have to say the point you said about the president, I think is just factually not correct. But rather than go after that, let me address the main point of a very good question, which is essentially, and I'll repeat it for the filming. Your question essentially is, in the fight for the freedom to marry, aren't there other important things that are not being tended to, or are not getting the resources they need, or are not getting the attention they need, and is marriage taking away from those? Or even if it isn't, shouldn't we also be working on those things? And how do I feel about all of that? Is that a fair summary? Okay. So one answer is that no anything is everything, and we can't expect anything to be everything. And indeed, we need to fight for everything. So I completely agree that that even as we work to win the freedom to marry and all that it brings with it, we also care about many other things, and we should absolutely be working and demanding and educating and engaging and not stopping until we've won those, and then there will still be other things. So I completely agree with that. What I don't agree with is what I think of as a false either-or that sometimes gets framed, that I think is actually very disempowering and winds up with us getting not everything, and not anything, but nothing. So I think it is important not to see things as either or, but to actually understand that we want everything, and we need to keep fighting for everything. But we don't want to penalize our success in getting part of what we want, because in getting part of what we want, we haven't yet gotten everything we want. So as a philosophical matter, I think it's bad activism to always judge the effort to do anything by the impossible measure of it's not everything. But more historically, the argument is simply actually not true. I mean, it is true we don't have everything we want yet, and we have to keep fighting. That is absolutely true. But we have actually, as a movement, and anybody who studies this now, as opposed to had a theory about it 20 years ago, can see, we have made more gains in our movement on every front, not enough, but more gains on every front during the marriage chapter of the movement than we did in the 20 or so years where most of the movement strategies were to try to work around what seemed like the unattainability of marriage. We have won more non-discrimination laws, more gender identity protections, more safe schools programs, more acknowledgement of the needs of gay seniors, and so on down the list. But equally important, we've also powerfully transformed the understanding of who gay people are, combated the bedrock prejudice and exclusion that was the foundation of all of the denials in a way that allows us to now turn more attention and more effort and more creativity and more strategy toward the winning of all the things we want. So I believe we need to reject the false either or, and we also need to look at our history and not just throw rhetoric at each other that is not founded in the actual facts of where we are. That said, it is absolutely appropriate to remind all of us that our work is not done, no matter how big a victory we win. And you also referenced the president, and as I said, I didn't think the facts were exactly right in the way you said it, but part of the reason I think you may be asking this question today is because actually the newspapers and Twitter and the blogosphere and Facebook have all been full of criticisms of the president for not mentioning the Employment Non-Discrimination Act and not mentioning the contractor's executive order that many of us want him to sign and so on. So it's just not true to say that there is no attention being paid to these things. That's what everybody actually is talking about right now. Yeah.
How will it happen, and when do you think it'll happen, that the U.S. Supreme Court will take on marriage again on a national level?
Right, so that's a great question. The question is, when do we think the Supreme Court will take the next marriage case and bring the freedom to marry to the country? So last week, Freedom to Marry, the Campaign to Win Marriage Nationwide, the organization I'm with, put out a strategy update in which we wanted to explain to people what we see as this extraordinarily dynamic landscape. There are now not only all the wins of the last several years and all this growth in public support that I talked about, and not all the battles, including this defense battle in Indiana and the defense battle that a little more quietly we're also mounting in New Mexico. Not only is all that happening, but there are actually about 40 marriage cases now bubbling out there across the country in about 20 or 21 states, brought by couples who are tired of waiting, who are excited by this momentum, who see the mandate that the Supreme Court laid down in its ruling last year in the so-called Defense of Marriage Act case, and want to get to the end. And so Freedom to Marry wanted everyone to see where are we and what does that mean for finishing the job, as your question asked. And the tagline that we basically have as we rolled this out last year, and again, you can look it up on freedomtomarry.org and read it more fully, is one strategy, two timelines. What does that mean? There has always been a strategy in this campaign. Freedom to Marry exists to propel a strategy and to drive it to this victory. Not every victory, this victory. The strategy, of course, is determined by the question, how will we win the freedom to marry nationwide? And the answer is, we will win the freedom to marry nationwide when the Supreme Court brings the country to national resolution. Why do we say that? Because that's how America does its civil rights business. That's how we've won every other epic civil rights transformation in our nation's history. The most famous marriage case of all so far, the best named case ever, Loving versus Virginia, is an example where the Supreme Court brought the country to national resolution. But the strategy takes note of the fact that when the Supreme Court does that, it's when a movement such as ours has succeeded in building a critical mass of states and a critical mass of support that together in interplay create the climate that encourage the court to finish the job. So the strategy has always been to build a critical mass of states and a critical mass of public support. And as you heard, we started with 0. We're now at 17. We started with 0 people having the freedom to marry. We're now at 40%. We started at 27% support. We're now at about 55% support. We continue to work to build this critical mass. That's the strategy. So the strategy remains. We're going to get to the Supreme Court, and we want to get to the Supreme Court when we're going to win. So the strategy is about maximizing our chance of winning. Now, strategy, one strategy, two timelines. Because it's become so dynamic, because there's so much momentum, because we're winning so many battles, because we're seeing Republicans as well as Democrats, as you saw the other day in the important vote here, because we're seeing wins coming out of not just New York and Vermont, but Iowa, Utah, Oklahoma, because we have these 40 cases, we now can actually see that there are two potential timelines to answer your question. There is a timeline whereby some mix of those cases, there are 3 already that are in the federal appellate level, in the circuits, in the 6th Circuit, in the 9th Circuit, and in the 10th Circuit. That could lead the Supreme Court to take one of those cases as soon as this fall and set it down for a potential likely decision by June of 2015. So we have the 2015 timeline. Of course, the court could also not do that. Those cases could not reach the court. The court could choose not to take a case. Something else could happen. We could lose. In which case, we wouldn't be on the 2015 timeline. It would turn out we're on the slightly longer timeline, which we're calling the 2017 timeline, but it could be 2016, it could be 2018, it could be 2020. I'm pretty confident, though I can't guarantee it, that we're talking about years, not decades. So here's the challenge, and then the opportunity. The challenge is we have to work this strategy on these 2 timelines because we don't know which timeline we're on, and we don't get to decide. Who decides? The Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will decide when it wants to take a case. So it will tell us, and we will find out someday, whether we are on the 2015 timeline or on the 2017 timeline. So since we don't know, we have to work on both. The good news for our campaign and for the work we all need to do, whether in Indiana or in Oklahoma or in New York, is pretty much the same. It's creating that critical mass and conveying to decision makers that America is ready. So when America is hearing voices, when the Supreme Court justices are hearing voices from Utah, the 1,300 families who now are married and their stories, when they're hearing from Oklahoma, when they're hearing from Indiana, when they're hearing Republicans, when they're hearing business leaders, when they're hearing from the South, then there will be that climate, and we will have created the critical mass, and they'll take a case, and we will win. In a few years, you will tell me whether it turned out we were on the 2015 or the 2017 timeline. We don't know that yet, but that's where it's going, and we know how to get there. Yeah.
You said earlier that the HJR-3 would remove a chance on this dialogue, but actually, if the Indiana House passed HJR-3, it would put a statewide referendum for everyone to vote on. So, in trying to block HJR-3 from passing, are you trying to prevent people in Indiana from deciding on whether they want to allow same-sex marriage or not? Even when, if you consider Indiana is a socially conservative-like state, and the last state to have a referendum on the issue, North Carolina, in 2012, passed the ban by 61%. Is this something anticipated in Indiana? Why it's significance to you?
Yeah. So there are 2 answers to your question. The question is, aren't we, by trying to block an effort to put a constitutional amendment vote on the ballot, preventing the conversation that I said was what the people of Indiana deserve? And the answer is no, and for 2 reasons. Number one, there's a difference between a conversation, giving people the reflective time to hear the stories, to get to know people, to not vote out of fear, to not be bombarded by attack ads, to not rush in a political moment to deprive one group of their fellow citizens of something they have. There's a difference between that and conversations and reflection and taking the time to absorb and not being pressured in political attack to vote hastily or cruelly or unfairly. So there's a difference between those 2 things. And secondly, what a constitutional amendment does is tie the hands of the people, of the legislature, of the judges, of every avenue of government, and of the normal process of protecting the balance of rights, which in our country we believe are not things that should be put up to a vote. If everything were put up to a vote, we wouldn't have rights. We would have votes. But we in the United States believe that while many things should be put up to, well, most things should be put up to a vote. Kings don't rule, the people do. So therefore, while most things should be put up to a vote, the equally important part of the American constitutional vision is that not everything gets put up to a vote. And this would be putting something up to a vote that should not be put up to a vote, which is whether one group of people get to share in something precious and important, and indeed a constitutionally respected freedom that others have.
Evan, at the risk of stating the obvious, I want to state the obvious, especially for the students in this audience. A student with a passion in 1983 had an idea. And think for a moment, let's reflect for a moment about all that has happened since then because of one person. Yes, I know you have a lot of people working for you, but you are such...
And with me.
And with you.
And against me.
And that's fine. But think about the difference one person can make, and write those good dissertations when you write them, students.
They don't even actually have to be that good. I got a B. But thank you. Yes?
In the future, do you foresee there being any collaboration with other groups who have been discriminated against, like minorities? I know gay rights is a huge issue, immigration. So do you see that intersection of other groups as well that have also been discriminated against?
Right, so the question is, do I see intersection amongst various groups who have endured discrimination and groups who are fighting against discrimination, whether the same discrimination or different iterations of discrimination? And the answer, of course, is absolutely. And not only do I sort of see this in an abstract way, that is the lived reality. The gay rights movement has worked enormously closely with the African American civil rights movement, with the Latino civil rights movement, with immigration reform causes, with women's causes, and the reproductive freedom and the empowerment of women. I mean, they are intertwined not only in the moral and intellectual ways that discriminations share commonalities. They're not all the same, but they share commonalities, whether it's often common enemies, common opponents, common tactics that are used against, and common strategies and common cause for moving forward. But they're also intertwined in the people themselves. Gay people are women. Women are Latino. You know, African Americans are part of the community. I mean, these are not like either-or categories, and they're not either-or causes. And what they all share most fundamentally in common is that what's really at stake is the ability of each one of us to have our difference and still be equal. That we shouldn't have to give up our differences in order to be treated equally. And what we also have in common is the freedom, the desire for the freedom, and the constitutional promise of the freedom to be fully who we are and not denied that opportunity to participate and contribute and share and pursue happiness because of characteristics that we may have. And so there are deep commonalities, both in the moral and intellectual, as I said, and in the actual lived experience of the people who are doing the work and enduring the discrimination and making the argument. Yeah.
First, I wanted to thank you for coming and speaking on this issue. It's obviously very important to a lot of us, or all of us here. Secondly, my question is, yesterday we actually had very different discussion, but on the same topic on what is marriage. And we had a scholar come who talked about this organic definition of marriage stemming from essentially a determination of penis and vagina, comprehensive sex. This argument that was based a lot off of natural law. And so my question is, in facing the criticisms that are coming from the other side, do you see any weak points in our movement from this argument or similar arguments? And how do we ensure that these natural law arguments or arguments that are similar don't pollute this conversation?
Well, that's a different question. They will pollute the conversation, but but that doesn't mean there's any weakness or connection, really, or validity. So the question is, the opponents of gay people's freedom to marry will make what sometimes they will admit or call natural law arguments, and sometimes they don't want to admit it, but that's what it is. And natural law, in turn, is actually really the putting forward of a particular religious view, but they dress it up in what they hope will be secular garb so that they can actually put it in court. Then it often boils down, as you began your question with penis vagina rules, to use your quoting their words. So, I mean, the quick way to dismiss that is to basically say that, anyone who's ever been married knows that marriage is about a lot more than sex, and it's certainly a lot more about penis and vagina. There's a whole lot else going on in a marriage, and that's true for gay people as for non-gay people, and it's reflected in the law's recognition that actually the law doesn't require people who are married to have sex. It requires people to do a bundle of other things and provides them with a bundle of other things, because indeed it's about love and commitment and companionship, and for some people raising children, for others building a joined family out of what began as two separate families. There's a whole lot else going on, and that's what the law in the United States recognizes and is about. And I actually think that most people completely understand that, and that as we have made the case to people and talked about the core values for which they marry, you almost never hear people volunteering penis and vagina as the reason they got married. The reason most people say they got married is love and the desire for commitment, and to reinforce that commitment and to make that commitment in front of others and to be held accountable for that commitment by their family, by their community, and by the law. Gay people want the freedom to marry for the same mix of reasons, beginning with love and commitment and family. And as we've made this case, and as we've talked about it, we've gone, as we said, from 27% to 55%, because indeed most people actually understand that that is indeed what really it's about. Now, that's not to disparage the importance of sex, or the importance of procreation, or the importance of raising children. And gay people share in those same aspirations too. And denying gay people the freedom to marry does nothing to promote sex or procreation or child raising. It simply makes some people who are doing those things' lives a lot harder. And that's the truth, and that's what has moved the American people. And of course, the natural law argument is usually made by a particular group of usually Catholic, anti-gay activists. And the heartening thing is that while, of course, they're entitled to their view, and they are entitled to believe what they want to believe and preach what they want to preach, a majority of American Catholics reject that view, and indeed support, by 63%, the freedom to marry.
Thank you.
Evan, when you look back at yourself in 1983,
The hair days?
and you think about the fact that you came up with a legal theory, but you know that that legal theory was necessary but not sufficient for where we are today. So that theory unfolded over a 30-year time horizon. If you had to give some advice to yourself in 1983 at this point, what would that advice be about understanding what that projection is?
So the question is, looking back, knowing what I know now, what would I have done differently, or what do I advise myself in that paper?
What would you tell a law student
Right.
about the way in which a theory has to intersect with the rest of the strategy?
Well, part of the reason I got a B on the paper. Not that it stings. But in all seriousness, part of the reason that I think it wasn't given an A was that most of the paper actually went all over the map and did not stay confined to the law. It was not a heavy-duty legal paper. It was section 4 of the 4 sections was, oh, and here's the legal argument. The first 3 sections were a much more multidisciplinary and wide-ranging, globe-trotting, culture-engaging discussion of feminism and of the etiology, the cause of sexual orientation, and the way in which gay people are treated, and the history of the first couple thousand years of the West and how that had treated gay people and how it was different from the way we treat gay people today, and therefore had it been different once, it could be different again, which came out of the book that changed my life, which led to the writing of the paper, which was a book called Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality by John Boswell that came out as I was in law school, and I wrapped it in paper and took it to the beach while I was visiting my grandparents in Florida and read it. Somebody who loved history devoured it, and it totally transformed my understanding and led me to want to write about this. So most of the paper did what you're sort of asking for, which is to actually take really clear note of the fact that law is not in its own bubble, and absolutely to achieve political and social transformation through law, you absolutely must engage the culture, politics, people's values. And in that sense, although it didn't use the language and didn't talk about it and didn't map out the work in the way that 30 years since I've been doing, it very much prefigured it, because it was very much based around the notion that to achieve true social transformation, political organizing, public education, cultural engagement, appeal to values, personal conversations must accompany litigation and legal change and legal theory. So I actually did the thing I think you're asking for and got punished for it in law school. But years later, in a profile of me in a newspaper, they went back and found the professor who had been my advisor. And he was quoted in the paper as saying, "It's so refreshing to see a student apply something he learned in law school." So I always felt very vindicated by that quote. Yeah, so I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
So a lot of the big civil rights cases have provoked serious backlash that undo a lot of the gains that the movement had before and a lot of the wins that were achieved in court. Are you worried that something similar could happen here, or do you think the critical mass that we're bringing along could avoid that?
Right. So the question is, we've often seen in civil rights struggles and social justice causes what gets characterized excuse me, as backlash, and am I worried about that? So in my book, Why Marriage Matters, I actually quote a speech by Martin Luther King, and I'll paraphrase it now. King says, I hate the word backlash. Backlash, King says, falsely conveys the idea that everything was sort of in equilibrium, and then those of us who want to change went too far or went too fast or provoked something, and backlash came. When in fact, he says, what really is happening is not a backlash, but a contest, a struggle between two visions of what the world should be, of how the country should be governed, what the law should do. I agree with King, and that's why I invoke that. My usual way of saying it, as I have spoken and campaigned, is that their backlash began before we lashed. Gay people were denied the freedom to marry. Gay people were mocked for even talking about the freedom to marry, aspiring to the freedom to marry. The first wave of marriage litigation was rubber stamped out of court. And not only were we denied the freedom to marry, but we were, and very much still to a great degree are, deprived of all kinds of important protections and opportunities. It is we who are working, and by we I mean gay and non-gay people who have a different vision, an inclusive vision of America, who are working to overthrow that discrimination. That work to overthrow discrimination, to overcome barriers, is not linear. There will be ups and downs, and there will be pushback and advance. But that's not backlash. That's what the work is. I think backlash is actually a very disempowering concept. And so, no, I don't worry about it. In fact, to the contrary, again, to invoke King, he actually has a really kind of ugly metaphor about where he says, I'm not afraid of tension. Tension is like a boil. You need to bring the tension's there. I'm not creating the tension. The tension's there, he says. We need to bring that tension to the surface and break it out to get rid of the boil. Pick your metaphor. So that's the sort of the philosophical approach that I bring. But I will also add one other thing, which is that if you think back on civil rights history and the ongoing civil rights struggles, whether of women or African Americans and others that we draw such inspiration and inheritance and lessons from, obviously there was massive, indeed manifest, resistance to advances in civil rights and efforts to overthrow segregation and to continuing to secure reproductive freedom from women and so on. But after Loving versus Virginia, there were no riots at the marriage bureaus. There were no Southern senators calling for the impeachment of Earl Warren after that ruling. The stakes are different, and the way it plays out are different. The American people accepted the Supreme Court's ruling on interracial marriage back in 1967, even though the polling showed 70% opposed interracial marriage. Here, as you've heard, we already have 55% of the American people supporting the freedom to marry. It's the Supreme Court that needs to catch up and get the law where the people already are. America is ready. Now we need to make Indiana ready too. Thank you.